The Fantastic Five, leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa meet to discuss their fast-growing economies. And working together, the Boao Forum kicks off in Hainan to promote regional integration. Hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of Asia Business Report. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. Now, leaders from 5 of the world's most powerful emerging markets are gathered in China today for the BRICS Summit. The acronym refers to Brazil, Russia, India, China and the newly joined South Africa. Together they account for almost 1/5 of the world's economy. Our correspondents take a look at the economic might of the original 4 members, starting with this report from Martin Patience in Beijing.
China is now the world's second largest economy with a GDP of about $5.8 trillion. And with that economic might, it makes China the key country in the BRIC grouping. Now, China, for example, is the largest trading partner of all the other BRIC nations. And while other countries are trying to stimulate more growth, China is actually trying to slow things down. What they want to see here is more sustainable growth, and what that means is increasing domestic consumption and relying less on exports for future growth.
Here in Russia, it's oil and gas which have fueled this country's economic resurgence. They account for about 60% of Russia's export revenues. And because the price of oil right now is so high, that translates into a huge windfall for Russia. Now, last year, the Russian economy was worth just under $1.5 trillion. That's 6 times more than it was a decade ago. But this dependency on oil and gas does have a downside, because if and when energy prices fall, this country's economy will feel the pinch. And so far, any attempts to diversify the economy have failed.
Here in India, the economy is forecast to grow between 8 and 9% this year. Once seen as a small player, today India is too big to ignore. Its $1.3 trillion economy has become an attractive destination for foreign investment. But India is no longer just a large market. It's also a major investor around the world. In a country that boasts some of the world's biggest multinational companies and industrialists like Ratan Tata and Sunil Mittal, India is increasingly growing clout on the world stage.
Here in Brazil, there is a sense of pride with the country's growing importance on the international stage. The 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics here in Rio de Janeiro are seen as symbols of this new stage in Brazilian development. Last year, the country's GDP of $2.2 trillion was the 7th largest in the world, but this remains among the most unequal societies on earth. Reducing poverty and the social gap are essential tasks if Brazil is to become not only an economic powerhouse, but also a modern democracy.
Paulo Cabral there ending that report. Now, Duncan Innes-Ker from the Economist Intelligence Unit in Beijing tells us what he expects from the BRICS meeting.
The key issue at the moment is really to allow the countries involved to get together to just discuss, and particularly for the sort of countries outside of China to talk with the Chinese leadership, because these days China is the most important bilateral trade partner for an awful lot of the BRIC countries. And in Brazil, for example, it's also now the biggest foreign investor. So in many ways, this is less a sort of an international summit than a series of bilateral summits rolled into one.
Now, it's interesting you say China is the focus here. We know Brazil and India, for instance, they're really concerned over large trade deficits with China. Critics, of course, saying that's caused by the deliberately undervalued yuan. How can these internal issues be resolved?
Well, I think Brazil, for one, is actually having quite a lot of success in exporting commodities to China, but the concern is about this sort of wave of imports that are perhaps having a negative impact on local manufacturing sectors. I think the issue of the currency is one that it's been high profile historically, but perhaps going forward, now that China's importing a lot more, this is going to be an issue that's going to be moving down the agenda. It's certainly not an issue on which they'll be able to reach an agreement at the BRICS Summit, and China is unlikely to make any concessions in terms of allowing the renminbi to appreciate more quickly.
Now, we know as well they're all emerging economies with competing interests, particularly when it comes to commodities to fuel their voracious industries. So how can they come together as an effective grouping?
I think as a grouping, the alliances so far do tend to be more on a sort of fortunate sort of issue-to-issue basis. For example, in the past, we saw China and India cooperating at the Copenhagen Summit when they felt that their interests were in alignment. But as you say, there are a lot of very big competing interests within the BRICS group. You have China, which is a big energy importer, for example, and Russia, which is a big energy exporter. So it is very difficult for them to come to an agreement on a lot of these sorts of subjects.
Duncan Innes-Ker there in Beijing. Meanwhile, another summit that's also taking place on the Chinese southern island of Hainan is the Boao Forum. It's a version of the World Economic Forum with an Asian twist. Its theme this year is inclusive development. BBC Business reporter Juliana Liu is there and joins us live from there right now. Juliana, explain the theme to us. What exactly is inclusive development?
Well, essentially, it's the idea that more people are able to partake of the benefits of economic growth and expansion. Of course, it was the paramount Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, who said that it's important to have some people get rich first, and that getting rich is glorious. But the problem in China now is that so many people have gotten rich so quickly that the rest of the country feels really left out. They're not able to partake of these benefits, and they feel that they're not getting the benefits of this enormous economic growth here in China. And if we look at statistically, for example, the Gini coefficient, which is a way of measuring inequality, it's risen above the 0.4 level that many experts believe is acceptable. But so this is a huge issue in the host country, China, and something that will be discussed among the different people who will be visiting, including politicians and business people.
Now, you mentioned the Gini coefficient there. Is there a sense then that the rich-poor gap is indeed rising?
Absolutely. Numbers obviously bear this out, but also the reality on the ground. Boao is a tiny, tiny fishing village in Hainan. I come here every year for the Boao Forum. Every time I come, it seems unrecognizable. This year, when we got off the highway, there were rows after rows of bright, shiny, stunning new condominiums that were built just in the last 6 months. And if you ask the people on the street, well, they say it's all mainlanders from across mainland China who come over to buy these beautiful new condominiums that the local people don't think they can afford. So this is obviously causing a lot of bad feeling here very locally, but just imagine that feeling being magnified across the breadth and width of China.
Right, and as you say that the Chinese are trying to promote the idea to equalize the balance between the rich and poor, you'd think there'd be huge support for this idea in China?
There is certainly a lot of support, obviously politically, because the country is going through a sensitive period of leadership transition, which will happen next year. And as you can imagine, there's so many people still living on less than $1 a day. And of course, they obviously support this idea. Some provinces, such as Guangdong, for example, an incredibly rich province in the south of China, are trying to tackle this problem by sending some of its cadres down to the poor villages to try to get them to raise rural incomes. So there is a lot of support. But on the other hand, there's some surprising opposition from private business people. For example, the government wants them to create low-cost housing, but there seems to be some opposition because they're worried they won't be able to make money from it.
All right, we'll have to leave there, Juliana. We'll hear from you again a little later. Now, to get more news and updates, you can check out our website at bbc.com/Asia Business. And in other news, a Chinese firm has won an intellectual property dispute against an American company, possibly a first. China's leading telecoms equipment maker Huawei took Motorola to court after it said it would sell equipment to Nokia Siemens Networks. Huawei disputed the disclosure of their business secrets and won an injunction. In the current settlement, Motorola would pay Huawei an undisclosed fee to transfer its contracts to Nokia Systems. Let's take a look at the markets now because, of course, today we're seeing oil prices heading up again. We saw Wall Street ending a volatile session, mostly flat. That'll give Asian bourses very little direction, I would say. Asian shares, though, traded in the US were higher. And that's it for this edition of Asia Business Report. But stay tuned, we'll be back with Asia Today.